The morning Rosemary brought Henry home was colder than she expected for spring. The sky was overcast, clouds dragging their shadows across the quiet neighborhood as though mirroring the boy's solemn eyes. Henry, age 9, sat in the back seat of her old sedan, backpack clutched tight in his lap. He didn't speak. Not once during the drive. Not when she offered him candy. Not even when she asked if he wanted the window rolled down. He just looked out. Rosemary had prepared the guest room with fresh sheets and a quilt she made herself years ago, back when she still believed she'd cradle her own baby in that fabric. Now it would warm a different kind of beginning. Henry stepped into the house slowly, shoes dusty, shoulders tense like he was walking into another temporary holding space. Another stop before someone else decided he wasn't worth the effort. "This is your room," Rosemary said, opening the door. He didn't move. She knelt down beside him and offered a quiet smile. "I know this is scary, but you don't have to be strong right now. You just have to be here." Still no words, but she saw his shoulders drop just slightly. That night, he didn't eat much. Rosemary made rice and stew. His file said it was his favorite. But he just picked at it, eyes darting like he expected someone to snatch it from him. After dinner, he sat in the corner of the room, not on the bed, backpack still on. Rosemary gently removed it after he'd fallen asleep and placed it beside him. Inside were just 3 things: a plastic dinosaur, a photo of his parents, burned at the edges, and a note from a social worker saying he had trouble trusting adults. She turned off the light, whispered a soft prayer, and left the door slightly open. Days passed like slow-moving fog. Henry rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in clipped sentences. "I'm done. I don't want that. Can I go outside?" Rosemary didn't push. Instead, she filled the silence with small things, humming gospel songs as she cleaned, placing an extra biscuit on his plate, and always keeping the porch light on until he was inside. One afternoon, she found him standing at the window watching neighborhood kids play soccer. His hand was pressed to the glass, unmoving. Rosemary said nothing, just handed him a worn-out soccer ball she'd bought from a thrift store. He didn't thank her. But the next day, he was outside, passing the ball between his feet, eyes still wary, but heart just beginning to thaw. A month later, Kenneth came home. He was 7, bookish and cautious. The opposite of Henry's quiet defensiveness, Kenneth asked questions. Lots of them. Why is the sky blue? How do cars work? Do you believe in angels? He'd stare at Rosemary with such intensity, it was almost unnerving. "What's your story?" he asked one evening over dinner. Rosemary chuckled. "I'm still living it." Kenneth thought about that for a moment, then nodded solemnly like he understood something most adults didn't. The house changed with 2 boys in it. Henry didn't warm to Kenneth right away. The 2 bickered often. Kenneth always had to be right, and Henry didn't like being corrected. But Rosemary had a way of making space for tension, without letting it turn to resentment. She'd sit them down together after arguments, make them talk it out, even if it took hours. "You're brothers now," she told them once, "and brothers fight, but they also forgive." It took time, but slowly a bond formed. Henry began looking out for Kenneth in the schoolyard. Kenneth started sharing his books, explaining big words to Henry. They didn't say thank yous, but Rosemary saw it in the way they sat closer during movie nights, the way they waited for each other after school. Then came the twins, Joshua and Joseph. Identical in face, but not in spirit. Joshua was loud, impulsive, always laughing or climbing something he wasn't supposed to. Joseph was more reserved, often shadowing his brother, but thinking twice before acting. Rosemary picked them up on a rainy Friday. They fight a lot, the social worker warned, but it's because they're scared. They've never known a day apart. Rosemary nodded, placing an arm around each child. Let them stay close. Her small house grew louder, louder than it had ever been. Crayons on the walls, socks in the sink, furniture mysteriously sticky. Rosemary had to implement chore charts, quiet hours, and even a no yelling before 8 a.m. rule. Brautenoit, but it was beautiful too. There were dance-offs in the living room, bubble baths that turned into miniature tsunamis. Laughter, deep, belly-aching laughter that filled every corner of the house. Henry, once so guarded, found himself chasing the twins around the backyard, yelling with playful annoyance. Kenneth tutored them in math, drawing equations with sidewalk chalk. Rosemary just watched, hands on her hips, heart swelling with both exhaustion and gratitude. Divine was last. Barely 5. Eyes like melted chocolate. It turned red when he was shy, which was often. He clung to Rosemary like a koala the day she brought him home, refusing to let go of her hand even as she cooked. "Can I call you Mama?" he asked that first night. Rosemary, blinking back tears, knelt beside him. "Only if you mean it." "I do," he whispered. That night, he slept beside her in the big bed, his little hand tucked in hers. She didn't move, didn't dare, because somehow, this smallest child filled the last space in her heart she didn't know was still empty. With 5 boys, life became both chaotic and sacred. There were battles over toothpaste, cereal brands, and TV time. There were nights when the fridge held little more than bread and peanut butter, and mornings when Rosemary skipped breakfast to make sure there was enough for school lunches. But there were also blessings, like the time Henry won his first school essay contest and shyly handed Rosemary the certificate with a grin he tried to hide. Or when Kenneth came home excited because a teacher said he was gifted. The twins learned to ride bikes, on the same day, of course, leading to skinned knees and triumphant cheers. Divine, too young for school yet, became the unofficial house DJ, spinning gospel tapes on a plastic player, dancing in circles until he collapsed in giggles. One Sunday morning, the family sat crowded around the kitchen table eating jollof rice. Rosemary watched them, her 5 boys, laughing over inside jokes, teasing each other, fighting over the last piece of chicken. She didn't have a husband, she didn't have much money. But in that moment, surrounded by mismatched chairs and chipped plates, she had everything she'd ever dreamed of. "Thank you," she whispered, to no one and everyone. And somehow, the silence around her echoed it back. Autumn came in waves, crisp air, fallen leaves, and the slow, sleepy rhythm of school and chores. Rosemary had developed a routine, not flawless, but steady. Mornings began at 6 a.m., with scrambled eggs, mismatched socks, and 5 boys shuffling down the hallway like a pack of sleepy wolves. Henry now sat at the table without being asked. Kenneth had started helping with Divine's shoelaces. The twins had begun sharing a bedroom again, whispering secrets under covers, lit by a flashlight. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. A family forged in fire, mistakes, forgiveness, and love. Then the letter came. It was a white envelope with no return address, placed carelessly in the mailbox among bills and grocery coupons. Rosemary read it 3 times at the kitchen counter. Her hand trembled. It was from Henry's biological uncle. He was petitioning for custody. That night, Rosemary tucked the letter in her Bible and sat alone on the porch swing. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the crickets were loud, uncaring. Inside, Henry was helping Divine build a puzzle, and the twins were chasing Kenneth with Nerf guns, and Rosemary sat outside, unraveling. Henry had been with her almost a year. She knew his rhythms now, how he needed 5 minutes of silence after school, how he preferred apples without the peel, how he only cried when he thought no one could hear. The thought of him leaving broke something deep inside her. "Who was that man?" Henry asked a week later, after the court hearing had been set. Rosemary didn't lie. "He's your mother's brother. He wants to take care of you." Henry didn't respond. He just looked at his hands. "Do you want to go?" He shrugged. But in the stillness of his breath, Rosemary heard the answer. No. But also, maybe. Because how could a child know? How could he trust this was forever? That night, Henry didn't eat much. He sat on the porch long after the others went to bed. Rosemary joined him without speaking. After a long silence, Henry whispered, "What if he only wants me because he feels guilty?" Rosemary put a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll make sure the court knows that." He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Court was cold, sterile. A room of laws and language that cared little for bedtime stories or scraped knees. Henry's uncle wore a suit and spoke about family responsibility. His lawyer made quiet jabs at Rosemary's finances, her single status, her lack of formal foster training. But then Henry spoke. He was quiet, looking down at his shoes as he stood in front of the judge. "I was scared all the time," he said. "Before her." He glanced back at Rosemary, who held her breath. "She doesn't have much, but she listens. She waits. She doesn't yell when I break stuff. She sits on the porch with me." The judge nodded, and for a moment it was all still. A week later, the letter arrived. Rosemary won custody. She wept on the kitchen floor, boys watching silently from the doorway, until Divine crawled into her lap and said, "It's okay, Mama." And it was. Winter came fast that year, and with it, illness. Joseph caught the flu first, bringing it home from school, then Joshua, then Kenneth. Rosemary found herself up at all hours of the night, rotating between rooms, handing out water, placing cool rags on foreheads, and whispering lullabies she hadn't sung in decades. One night, she sat beside Kenneth's bed as he tossed in a fevered sleep. He murmured something. She leaned closer. "What, baby?" "Don't leave us." Rosemary's heart cracked open like a frozen river in spring. "I never will." When the fever passed, and all the boys were healthy again, they celebrated with pancakes and a blanket fort that took over the entire living room. Divine decorated it with paper stars, while the twins strung battery lights through the folds. Henry cooked eggs for the first time. Kenneth wrote a poem about survival. Rosemary taped it to the fridge like it was scripture. That evening, they huddled inside the fort, all 6 of them, and watched a movie on her old laptop. Rosemary fell asleep with a twin on each arm. Divine curled at her side like a cat, and the older 2 whispering about superheroes. Spring bloomed. So did the boys. Kenneth joined the school's debate team and brought home a tiny trophy that he placed right next to his stack of library books. Joshua and Joseph became obsessed with building things, Legos, cardboard castles, even a makeshift go-kart that broke a fence and nearly Divine's leg. Henry started writing stories, quiet ones, sad ones, beautiful ones. Rosemary read them in secret, sometimes crying softly over a boy who didn't know his words could move mountains. And Divine, sweet Divine, learned to tie his shoes, ride a bike with training wheels, and whistle. He did all 3 in 1 week and insisted the house throw him a party. They did, with chocolate cupcakes and streamers made from toilet paper. One day, A social worker came by for an annual visit. She asked Henry if he was happy. He looked around at the chaotic living room, Kenneth in a beanbag reading, the twins arguing over whose Lego was better, and Divine asleep on the rug. "I'm not happy every day," he said honestly. "But I'm home." The social worker smiled and turned to Rosemary. "You've built something here." Rosemary looked at her boys. No, her sons. "I didn't build it," she replied. "We grew into it." And so the days passed. There were still storms, still broken things, still tears over math homework, growing pains, and the grief that didn't vanish just because they had each other. But there was also stillness, the kind that comes from knowing someone will always wait up for you, that there will always be biscuits on the table, even if they're burnt, that someone will whisper goodnight, even when the world feels too big. One night, Divine crawled into her bed again. "Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Are we lucky?" Rosemary turned to him, brushing back his curls. "No, sweetheart. We're blessed." And she meant every word. It started with Henry. He was 14 when he began pulling away. Not in loud ways, but in quiet retreats. His homework sat untouched on the kitchen table. His room became his fortress. When Rosemary knocked, he'd mumble, "I'm fine," though his eyes said otherwise. One evening, she stood outside his door, hesitant to knock again. She spoke gently through the wood. "You don't have to talk, but I'll be here. I always will." No answer. She waited. Then the door cracked open, just enough for his voice to slip through. "I don't know who I am." Her heart twisted. Henry had never known his father. His mother had died young, and the man who once tried to take him back had vanished again after losing the custody case. All Henry had now was Rosemary, and even that seemed uncertain in the storm of his teenage heart. "You're my son," she said softly. "That's a good place to start." The twins were a different kind of storm. At 13, Joshua and Joseph were inseparable and unstoppable. If mischief had a face, it was theirs. Rosemary once found half the kitchen painted gold because they wanted to make it royal for her birthday. Another time, they snuck a stray puppy into the house and tried to hide it under Divine's bed for a week. But trouble, real trouble, found them at school. They were caught in a fight, defending Kenneth from bullies who mocked his quiet nature and called them all charity cases. When the principal called Rosemary in, she listened quietly to the lecture about discipline, consequences, and the threat of expulsion. She waited until the office emptied out. Then she looked the boys in the eye. "Tell me the truth." And they did. Her hands trembled on her lap as they spoke. Not from anger, but from pride and heartbreak. They had defended their brother like warriors, but the world saw them as threats, not protectors. She pulled them close. "I'm proud of you for standing up for each other, but next time we fight with words, not fists." Joshua grinned. "Like Kenneth." "Exactly." Joseph nodded. "We'll try." And they did. Sort of. Kenneth, meanwhile, retreated inward. At 12, he had already developed a mind like a maze, sharp, curious, and prone to getting lost in dark corners. He loved books more than people, but he also carried a quiet pain that Rosemary couldn't always reach. One day, she found a notebook in his backpack filled with scribbles, thoughts, fears, questions. What if no one really wants me? What if she sends me back too? What if this isn't forever? Rosemary sat on the edge of his bed that night, the notebook open between them. "You're not going anywhere," she said gently. "Even when you drive me crazy, even when you're silent for days, you're mine." He didn't answer, but his head rested against her shoulder. That was enough. And Divine, sweet, sensitive Divine, was still learning what the world meant. He was 8 now, talkative, musical, always singing something, a gospel chorus, a TV jingle, or a melody he made up on the spot. But he asked big questions. One afternoon, he came home from school, sat on the porch, and asked, "Why do other kids say I don't have a real family?" Rosemary paused. "What do you think a real family is?" He shrugged. "I think it's people who love you." "Then you already have one." He smiled. "Okay." And just like that, the worry disappeared, for now. Money was always tight. The house groaned under the weight of 5 boys. Groceries vanished in hours. Shoes were constantly outgrown. School fees piled up like autumn leaves. Rosemary took on extra shifts at the community clinic, sometimes arriving home well past midnight. She made do with hand-me-downs, thrift stores, and prayers. But she never let the boys feel the weight of it. They had birthdays with cake, even if it was homemade and lopsided. Christmas with second-hand toys wrapped in newspaper. They laughed. They fought. They healed. One night, she collapsed on the couch after a double shift, shoes still on. When she woke hours later, someone had placed a blanket over her, a glass of water nearby, and a note in Divine's handwriting. "You're our hero, Mama." She cried quietly, clutching the note like a lifeline. As the years crept on, the family learned how to weather the hard days. There were doctor visits, teacher conferences, nights of fever and worry, mornings with forgotten lunches and missed buses, arguments over chores, over phones, over who got the last pancake. But there was also laughter. Endless, wild laughter. Like the night the power went out and the boys turned the house into a haunted mansion using flashlights and sheets. Or the Sunday mornings when Rosemary let them play chef and ended up with burnt toast and eggshells in her coffee. They learned to love in the chaos. Then came the accident. One rainy afternoon, the twins were biking down a hill too fast. A car turned too sharply. Tires screeched, metal bent. Joseph ended up in the hospital with a broken arm and bruised ribs. Joshua escaped with cuts and a deep, burning guilt. Rosemary rushed to the hospital, heart pounding. When she saw Joseph lying in the hospital bed, pale and scared, she couldn't hold back the tears. "I told you to be careful," she whispered, brushing hair from his forehead. "We're sorry," Joshua mumbled from the corner, refusing to meet her eyes. Later, when Joseph was asleep, she sat beside Joshua. "It's okay to be scared," she told him. "It's okay to make mistakes." "I should have stopped him," he whispered. "We all make bad choices. What matters is what we do next." He finally looked up at her. "Will he be okay?" She nodded. "Yes, but promise me. No more racing down hills." "I promise." And he kept it. That summer, things began to shift again. Henry got his first part-time job at a local hardware store. Kenneth was invited to a regional science fair. The twins started designing clothes on old graph paper, arguing over colors and fabric that didn't exist yet. Divine wrote a song and sang it at church, earning a standing ovation and 2 hugs from strangers. They were changing, growing into their own dreams. And Rosemary watched with pride and fear. Because deep down, she knew. Motherhood was a long, slow goodbye. You raise them to leave, but you never stop hoping they'll come back. One evening, she sat on the porch with Divine curled beside her. "Mama?" "Yes?" "When I grow up, will I still live here?" She smiled, tracing circles on his back. "Maybe for a while. Then maybe you'll find your own place." "I want to build you a castle," she laughed. "A castle, huh?" "With a music room and a kitchen just for you." She kissed his forehead. I'd like that. And in that moment, as the sun dipped behind the trees and laughter echoed from inside the house, Rosemary felt it again, that fierce, overwhelming truth. She hadn't given birth to these boys, but she had been chosen, somehow, to raise them, to love them, to guide them through the mess and magic of growing up. High school was like a new universe, and each of the boys reacted to it in different ways. The halls were bigger, the expectations heavier, and the world outside the home felt louder, colder. Rosemary sensed the shift long before anyone spoke it aloud. They were still her boys, but they were also becoming young men. And that's when she realized love didn't mean keeping them close. It meant preparing them to stand on their own. Henry had found a quiet rhythm. Now 17, he worked weekends at the hardware store, helped carry groceries without being asked, and even took over fixing the leaky sink in the kitchen. He had grown taller, quieter, more thoughtful, but Rosemary still worried. Because behind those responsible eyes was a lingering pain. Henry had never really asked about his birth parents, but one autumn night, while raking leaves in the backyard, he said, "Do you think they ever think about me?" The question hit like a wind gust. Rosemary put down her rake. "I think love doesn't always look like staying, but it doesn't mean they didn't care." He nodded slowly. "I don't hate them. I just wonder." She wrapped an arm around his shoulder. "You're allowed to wonder, and if you ever want to look for them, we'll do it together." He didn't answer right away, but later that night, she found a note taped to her door. "Not yet, but thank you for being the one who stayed." Kenneth, now 15, had become the house's quiet center. Books still consumed him. Science fiction, quantum physics, obscure world history. His room looked like a library crash landed into a teenager's mind. But for the first time, he was starting to open up. It began when a teacher invited him to apply for a mentorship at a nearby university. Kenneth had nearly tossed the letter. "What if I don't fit in?" he asked Rosemary at dinner. She looked over her glasses. "Sweetheart, you've never fit in. You were born to stand out." He cracked a rare smile, and when he was accepted, the entire family celebrated with a handmade cake and a banner that read, "Go, Professor K." He didn't say much, but when he hugged Rosemary that night, it was the first time he said, "I love you," out loud. She carried those 3 words like a sacred gift. The twins, at 14, were becoming legends, at school and in the neighborhood. They had launched a clothing line called Second Chance, selling custom shirts out of their backpacks. Their designs were bold, their confidence even bolder. But one afternoon, Rosemary got a call. The police. Joshua and Joseph had been caught tagging a mural downtown. Graffiti. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even vulgar. But it was illegal. She picked them up in silence. The officer had been kind, noting that the artwork was actually beautiful. But the law was the law. Back home, the boys braced for fury. Instead, Rosemary sat them down at the kitchen table. "Why did you do it?" Joseph looked down. "We wanted people to see what we can do. We wanted something big." Joshua added, "Everyone sees us as just kids from your house. We wanted to be more." She nodded slowly. "I understand." They looked up, surprised. "But from now on, your art goes through the right doors. You want the world to see you? Then make them open their eyes the right way." She signed them up for a youth art program. Their first mural, done with permission, appeared 3 months later on a downtown building. A towering portrait of 5 boys around a kitchen table with a woman at the head, her hand outstretched in blessing. They called it the table we were given. And Divine, now 10, was turning into a light that couldn't be dimmed. His voice had begun to shift, still angelic, but stronger, richer. He joined the local choir and was soon singing solos at Sunday services. People began recording him on their phones, sharing his voice online. One video went viral. A pastor from Atlanta called, offering a chance for Divine to join a youth gospel tour. Rosemary hesitated. It meant travel, press pressure. But Divine looked at her and said, "Mama, I want to do this, but only if you're okay." She smiled, though her heart was tight. "You were born to be heard, baby. Just promise me you'll come back." He grinned. "Always." And off he went, her youngest, flying sooner than she ever imagined. The house began to feel different. Not empty, but not as noisy, not as chaotic. There were nights when only 1 or 2 boys were home. When dinner was quiet, not a hurricane of elbows and laughter. Rosemary often found herself sitting alone at the table, listening for footsteps that didn't come. But she also found something else. Herself. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since her 20s. Abstract pieces, messy and bold. She even showed some at the local gallery. People liked them. She was more than just their mother. She was a woman with stories, pain, talent, and dreams of her own. One night, as a storm rolled in, all 5 boys were miraculously under one roof again. Henry brought groceries. Kenneth arrived late from a lecture. The twins carried paint on their sleeves. Divine had his suitcase in hand and stories from the road. They crowded around the kitchen table, eating stew, passing bread, arguing about movies, laughing about everything. Rosemary watched them all. So different now. So full of promise. So hers. When the meal ended, Henry stood and raised a glass of apple cider. "To Mama," he said, "for never letting us forget where we came from, and never letting it hold us back." They all raised their glasses. To Mama. That night, as they all settled in, 1 on the couch, 2 in sleeping bags, 1 in the old bunk, Rosemary walked through the house in silence. She paused at each doorway, listened to their breathing, remembered the nights when they were still small, afraid of thunder, craving lullabies, carrying wounds the world had tried to etch into them. Now they were healing, becoming, and she was learning how to let go, gently, lovingly, 1 boy at a time. But one thing she knew with unshakable certainty: no matter where they went, no matter who they became, they would always carry the name she gave them. The year Henry left for college, the house felt like it exhaled, a long, quiet sigh. Rosemary watched his old bedroom like it was a museum. His books still lined the shelf. His old sneakers sat by the door, as if he might burst back in after soccer practice. He had gotten a partial scholarship and taken on 2 jobs to cover the rest. Refused to let Rosemary dip into her savings. "I need you to focus on the others," he said. "You already got me this far." The morning he left, he hugged her tighter than he ever had. "No matter what happens," he whispered, "you were my turning point." She cried as he pulled away in the used Corolla she helped him buy. A single bird flew overhead, cutting across the morning sky like a promise. Kenneth changed next. He had once been the quietest, but college transformed him into something more: confident, even opinionated. He began tutoring underprivileged kids on weekends, and for the first time in his life, he started dating. Rosemary was surprised when he brought a girl home. Her name was Maya. Bright eyes, kind laugh. The 2 of them discussed everything from politics to poetry while doing dishes. She makes me feel safe, Kenneth told Rosemary later. She smiled. That's the best kind of person. It was the first time she saw him hold someone's hand without hiding it. The twins, however, were on fire, in the best and worst ways. Their clothing brand had exploded locally, and they now ran an online shop with hundreds of orders a week. But with success came conflict. Joshua wanted to expand, get investors, and scale big. Joseph wanted to keep it authentic, handmade, rooted in the message. Their arguments grew frequent, loud. One night, it turned physical. A shove in the kitchen, a shattered bowl. Rosemary stepped between them, her voice calm but firm. Do you even remember why you started this? They both froze. You were trying to prove that you weren't throwaways, that your story mattered. She looked from one to the other. Don't lose each other, just to win the world. They apologized, to her and to each other. But the lesson lingered. They went on to create a campaign called Brotherhood Over Brand. The sales doubled. Divine was still a child in some ways, 13, wide-eyed and curious, but his fame was starting to shape him. He was invited to sing at a televised charity gala. Rosemary bought him a new suit, adjusted his tie like it was his first day of school. She could see his nerves through his smile. You nervous? She asked in the car. He nodded. What if I mess up? She squeezed his hand. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be real. That night, Divine stood under the spotlight and sang Amazing Grace with such aching clarity that even the camera crew had tears in their eyes. Afterward, a record label approached them. They wanted to sign him, tour him, brand him, turn him into something bigger. Rosemary stared at the contract for days, then asked Divine the one question that mattered. Do you want this, or do you think you're supposed to want it? He looked at her, smaller than the world thought, and said, I want to sing, but I want to stay your son more. So, they said no. He kept singing, but on their terms. Then came the storm. Not weather, not scandal, but grief. Mrs. Dorsey, Rosemary's oldest neighbor, the woman who once brought over homemade muffins when the boys first arrived, passed away in her sleep. It shouldn't have broken Rosemary the way it did. But it did, because with Mrs. Dorsey gone, it felt like the last piece of the before was gone too. She stopped painting, stopped cooking big dinners. She drifted, and the boys noticed. Joseph came home one weekend to find her sitting in the dark, her tea cold. You okay? He asked. She didn't lie. No. He sat beside her in silence, then whispered, It's okay to not be the strong one all the time. And for the first time since the boys had come into her life, she let one of them hold her as she cried. Spring returned, as it always does, and with it, new beginnings. Kenneth graduated with honors. Henry returned for the summer and started teaching life skills to foster youth. The twins opened a small studio downtown. Divine released his first independent album online, recorded in their living room. Rosemary painted again. One massive canvas. Deep reds, streaks of gold. A black bird mid-flight. She titled it, Becoming. It sold within a week. But she didn't care about the sale. She cared that it came from her. One warm evening, all 5 boys returned for a Sunday dinner. They ate on the back porch, candles flickering, wind humming through the leaves. Remember when we thought this porch was falling apart? Joshua joked. It was, Divine laughed. We hammered nails into everything. Rosemary just smiled, watching them bicker, laugh, tease. They were men now. But in the light of the setting sun, she could still see their shadows. 5 little boys racing through the grass, fighting over the last biscuit, needing her in ways they didn't even understand yet. And in that moment, she knew. They didn't just survive. They were thriving. And so was she. The summer before Divine turned 18, everything shifted again. Not in chaos this time, but in clarity. He had been working on new music, recording in the makeshift studio the twins helped him build in the basement. Rosemary could hear the melodies through the floorboards, haunting, soulful, stitched with words that felt too deep for someone so young. One night, he asked her to sit with him. "I wrote something. About you." She sat on the old sofa, knees tucked under her, like she had when the boys were small. He began to sing. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but every word was a memory. 5 forks on the table, 1 heart in the room. She gave us her everything, when she had no one to. Tears spilled from her eyes before the first verse ended. She didn't clap. She didn't need to. She just opened her arms, and Divine, tall now but still her baby, folded into her embrace. As the younger ones stepped further into adulthood, Rosemary began to notice something new in herself. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that a nap could fix. This was deeper, a slow ache in the bones, a quiet stiffness in the mornings, the way her breath caught walking up the stairs. She told no one, but Henry noticed. He started calling more often, visiting every weekend. Kenneth took over all her bills without a word. Just automatic payments and a gentle reminder. This is just repayment on a million bedtime stories. The twins repainted the house one weekend while she was away with Divine at a music retreat. When she came back, the walls were bright, warm, like new beginnings. She smiled and said nothing, but that night she sat at her kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, her tea untouched. Because what happens when the people you raised no longer need you? What happens when the world you built grows taller than you ever imagined? One afternoon, she went to the clinic for what she thought was routine. She came back with a list of things she didn't expect: high blood pressure, mild arthritis, and early signs of type 2 diabetes. "Manageable," the doctor said, "but you need to slow down." Slow down. The words felt foreign. Her whole life had been built on motion, waking early to pack lunches, staying up to mend hems, working weekends, attending parent meetings, driving to recitals, games, hospitals. Slowing down felt like stepping out of her own story. But when she told the boys, carefully, gently, they didn't panic. They reorganized everything. A new routine bloomed. Divine brought her healthy meals 3 times a week. Kenneth installed a smart home system, voice-activated lights, reminders for medications, automatic thermostat controls. Henry bought her a new bed with pressure-relieving foam. The twins started taking her on gentle walks, to art galleries, botanical gardens, open-air concerts. Not once did they treat her like a burden. They treated her like royalty. Then came the birthdays. Divine turned 18. He planned a party, but what he truly wanted was simpler. "Just a day with all of us," he said. "And Mama." They grilled food in the backyard, played old music, brought out photo albums, laughed until the stars came out. At the end of the night, Divine stood up, cleared his throat. "I know we've all done things," he said. "Big things. But Mama, you're the reason for every note I've ever sung, every verse I'll ever write." He handed her a small box. Inside was a chain with a golden pendant. It read, "The first note." She wore it every day after that. Later that fall, something extraordinary happened. All 5 boys, separately and without knowing, began making big decisions. Henry proposed to a woman he'd been dating for years. Lillian, a calm, book-loving woman who worked in urban development. Kenneth, after years of quiet reflection, told Rosemary something she already knew in her heart. "I think I want to marry Maya." She nodded with a soft smile. "I've been waiting." The twins! They made it a double surprise, announcing their engagements at the same dinner, prompting laughter, disbelief, and joy all at once. And Divine, he wasn't seeing anyone yet, but he said something that made Rosemary's heart still. "When I do marry, I want it to feel like your love, unshakable, brave, whole." What came next was unorthodox: 5 proposals, 5 engagements, and then one collective idea. "What if," Joshua said one night, "we had one wedding?" The others stared at him. All of us, together. One big celebration. One day. One ceremony. At first it sounded ridiculous, but the more they thought about it, the more it made sense. "We started together," Joseph said. "Why not take this step together too?" Rosemary listened, quiet, then asked, "But why just one day?" And Kenneth, with a smile, said, "Because we want that day to be about you too." And so the planning began. A wedding like no other. 5 couples, 1 mother. A celebration of unity, legacy, and love. The guest list grew. Old friends, neighbors, teachers, people who had seen the journey. Vendors donated services after hearing the story. A designer offered to create a dress for Rosemary. No cost. "It's not just a gown," the woman said, adjusting fabric on Rosemary's shoulder. "It's armor. For a warrior." The night before the wedding, the house was loud. All 5 boys stayed the night, like they used to on Christmas Eve. They talked late into the night, of childhood fears, of teenage mistakes, of scraped knees and whispered prayers. And then Divine asked the one question that quieted the room. "What if she hadn't taken us in?" Silence. Then Henry, steady as always, said, "Then none of this would exist. Not just us, but the men we became." They sat with that truth. And in the silence, you could almost hear the echo of 1,000 bedtime stories, the warmth of meals made with little, the strength of a woman who held them up when the world tried to tear them down. The morning of the wedding dawned quietly. No bird song, no dramatic sunbeams, just a hush, like the world itself held its breath. Inside Rosemary's home, the scent of coffee lingered, mixing with faint cologne and polished shoes. Her house, once filled with backpacks and scraped knees, now bustled with tuxedos, flower arrangements, and nervous laughter. Divine paced by the window, humming the melody of a new song he hadn't finished. The twins, Joshua and Joseph, double-checked their vows, identical, naturally, except for one line each they insisted stay a surprise. Kenneth stood near the mirror, adjusting a tie he'd tried to get right 3 times already. And Henry? He was in the backyard, staring up at the sky. "Just needed a minute," he said, when Rosemary found him. He smiled at her in that way only a son who had memorized every line of your face could. A smile that said, "Thank you," without words. She stood beside him. "Are you ready?" she asked, half teasing. He nodded. "Been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it until I had you." The venue wasn't a church or a banquet hall. It was the same city park, where she'd first taken the boys for a picnic. The one where Divine had run headlong into a goose, where Joseph broke his front tooth on the swing, where they had once released balloons to honor their lost mothers. Now it was draped in ivory linens, soft lights, and laughter. 5 grooms, 5 brides, one matriarch at the center of it all, not as a guest, but as the heart. The ceremony wasn't traditional. Each couple wrote their own vows. Each pair spoke of resilience, not perfection, of how their journey had been molded not just by love for one another, but by the love that raised them. Rosemary sat in the front row, dressed in a gown of soft gold, the pendant, the first note, shining on her chest. Tears fell freely, not the trembling kind of grief, but the full, cleansing kind. Joy, relief, disbelief that something so beautiful had grown from so much pain. When it was Divine's turn to speak, he didn't stand alone. He stepped up with his guitar. "I'm not marrying today," he said, "but I am making a vow. To her." He turned to Rosemary. "You gave us a family, a future, a name, but above all, you gave us belief. In ourselves, in love, in second chances." Then he began to play, a song written for that day, not about tragedy, not about survival. The morning of the wedding dawned quietly. No bird song, no dramatic sunbeams, just a hush, like the world itself held its breath. Inside Rosemary's home, the scent of coffee lingered, mixing with faint cologne and polished shoes. Her house, once filled with backpacks and scraped knees, now bustled with tuxedos, flower arrangements, and nervous laughter. Divine paced by the window, humming the melody of a new song he hadn't finished. The twins, Joshua and Joseph, double-checked their vows. Identical, naturally. Except for one line each they insisted stay a surprise. Kenneth stood near the mirror, adjusting a tie he'd tried to get right 3 times already. And Henry? He was in the backyard, staring up at the sky. "Just needed a minute," he said, when Rosemary found him. He smiled at her in that way only a son who had memorized every line of your face could. A smile that said, "Thank you," without words. She stood beside him. "Are you ready?" she asked, half teasing. He nodded. "Been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it until I had you." The venue wasn't a church or a banquet hall. It was the same city park where she'd first taken the boys for a picnic. The one where Divine had run headlong into a goose, where Joseph broke his front tooth on the swing, where they had once released balloons to honor their lost mothers. Now it was draped in ivory linens, soft lights, and laughter. 5 grooms, 5 brides, one matriarch at the center of it all, not as a guest, but as the heart. The ceremony wasn't traditional. Each couple wrote their own vows. Each pair spoke of resilience, not perfection, of how their journey had been molded not just by love for one another, but by the love that raised them. Rosemary sat in the front row, dressed in a gown of soft gold, the pendant, the first note, shining on her chest. Tears fell freely. Not the trembling kind of grief, but the full, cleansing kind. Joy, relief, disbelief that something so beautiful had grown from so much pain. When it was Divine's turn to speak, he didn't stand alone. He stepped up with his guitar. "I'm not marrying today," he said, "but I am making a vow. To her." He turned to Rosemary. "You gave us a family, a future, a name. But above all, you gave us belief. In ourselves, in love, in second chances." Then he began to play, a song written for that day. Not about tragedy, not about survival, but about coming home. The chorus echoed softly through the trees. She lit the fire when the world was cold. She held the light when we lost our hold. We rise today on the strength she gave. Every vow we make, she made. By the time he finished, no eye was dry. Not even the florist's. The reception was chaos in the best way. Children danced barefoot in the grass. The twins lifted Rosemary onto their shoulders at one point, chanting, "Queen Mama," until she made them put her down, laughing. Henry gave a toast that was less a speech and more a sermon. We often talk about legacy, he said, but legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's what we build into others. And Rosemary didn't just raise 5 boys. She built 5 men. Men who know how to love, how to give, how to stand when life pushes you down. He raised his glass to the woman who made kings out of orphans. Late into the night, after the music slowed and the guests began to drift away, Rosemary stood alone at the edge of the lake near the park. The moon shimmered across the water. Footsteps approached. Divine. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Too full." She smiled. "Of cake? Of everything." He took her hand. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't taken us in?" She exhaled slowly. "Sometimes. But then I look at you, at your brothers, at what today was, and I realize this was my life." She looked at the reflection in the water. "I didn't miss out on anything. I chose this, and I'd choose it again, 1,000 times over." He pulled her into a hug, one hand on the back of her head the way she used to cradle him. In that moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to, because the vows had already been spoken. The promise had already been made. And it wasn't just by the couples who wed that day. It was made by all of them, sons and mother alike, to never forget, to always come back, to build forward, and always honor what came before. Weeks passed since the wedding, yet the glow of that day lingered like a sweet perfume that refused to fade. Rosemary still woke up early, as she always had. Old habits die tenderly. She swept her small porch, fed the birds, watered the roses blooming in her garden, and sat quietly with her tea before the day began. But everything had changed. Now, children's laughter filled the air every Sunday, echoing through her new home like music. Her sons visited weekly, often with their wives, sometimes with grandchildren in tow. Her once quiet life was now a carousel of little shoes by the door, juice spills on the rug, drawings taped to the fridge, and toy cars left under the couch. And she loved every bit of it. They called her Mama Rose now, even the neighbors. On one especially warm afternoon, she stood in her kitchen, apron tied neatly, flour dusting her cheeks, preparing her famous meat pies. The same ones she used to make when they could barely afford meat. Back then, she stretched love the way she stretched dough, with nothing but heart and hope. Kenneth stepped in, laptop under his arm, tie loose from a long meeting. He kissed her cheek. "Got a minute?" he asked. She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Always." He sat her down and opened the laptop. The screen blinked to life. A draft of a book. Her story. Their story. "You told us not to waste time on you," he said softly. "But the world needs to know. About you. About how you didn't just survive. You changed lives." She stared at the screen, the title catching her breath. "The Mother of Kings. The Rosemary Thompson Story." She chuckled, teary-eyed. "I'm not royalty." Kenneth smiled. "You are to us." The book was published just months later. It wasn't flashy or viral at first, but it didn't need to be. It was honest, raw, real. Teachers read it in classrooms. Mothers wept, reading it in hospital waiting rooms. Foster parents quoted it in court hearings. A minister once held it up during a sermon about purpose. Rosemary didn't chase any of this. In fact, she shied away from most of the attention. But when she was invited to speak at a youth conference, she reluctantly agreed, mostly because all 5 of her sons insisted on going with her. That day, she stood in front of a room full of young people. Some broken, some hardened, many simply waiting for someone to see them. She didn't give a motivational speech. She told the truth. "I wasn't chosen," she said plainly. "I chose, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt." She paused. "I didn't know how to be a mother. I just knew how to love, and that was enough." The silence that followed was louder than applause. Divine's career continued to blossom. His latest album, titled Roots, debuted to critical acclaim. The title track was dedicated to Rosemary. In the music video, he recreated scenes from their early years: mismatched school uniforms, boys sharing one plate of food, Rosemary ironing clothes late at night while humming an old gospel tune. The song ended with a line that struck every listener like a stone skipping across still water. "She built our wings with her bare hands so we could fly past the life she gave up." It went viral overnight. The twins took their fashion line global. At Paris Fashion Week, during their final runway walk, models emerged wearing pieces embroidered with a name on the inside hem: Rosemary. During the standing ovation, they pulled her on stage. Cameras flashed. She laughed awkwardly, hugging them both. Backstage, one reporter asked her, "How does it feel to be the muse behind one of the most successful fashion shows of the year?" She paused, smiled gently, and said, "I'm not a muse. I'm just a mother who stayed." Henry, ever the quiet storm, became a guest lecturer at a top university. One afternoon, while giving a talk about engineering innovation, he went off script. He spoke of building bridges, not just of steel and cables, but of love and sacrifice. "I design systems," he said, "but my foundation was built by a woman who taught me what true strength looks like." Later, when asked by a student what inspired his resilience, he simply said, "Her. Always her." Then came the national recognition. The president's office reached out. An award for humanitarian influence. A televised ceremony. Rosemary wore the same royal blue dress from the wedding, slightly altered by the twins to fit her softer frame. She stood on stage as the announcer listed her journey, from abandoned wife to single foster mother, from unnoticed volunteer to a woman who changed 5 lives, and by extension, thousands more. As the medal was placed around her neck, the audience stood, not out of formality, but out of awe. In her short speech, she said, "I am honored, but I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stayed when it was easier to leave. I listened when it was easier to ignore. And I loved when I had every reason to close my heart. That's not heroism. That's humanity." Back home, the medal stayed in a box, not because she didn't value it, but because for her, the real award was in the moments no one saw. Henry fixing her roof without being asked, Kenneth showing up with groceries, the twins making her tea after a long day, Divine singing softly in the kitchen while helping her wash dishes. These weren't gestures of repayment. They were reflections of what she had poured into them for decades. Then came a morning that surprised even her. Her old house, the one with the leak. The wind was soft that morning, the kind of morning that only comes when spring and summer hold hands in passing. Rosemary stood at the edge of the garden behind the Rosemary house, her hands deep in the soil, planting marigolds. She didn't need to. She wasn't the gardener anymore. But she liked to start the season herself. A boy named Elijah watched from the window. Only 10 years old, he was the newest arrival, quiet, withdrawn, carrying grief like an invisible backpack. The staff had told Rosemary he hadn't spoken much since arriving, but she saw herself in him. So she came by every week, sat on the bench near the porch, brought cookies, hummed old hymns while pruning roses. That morning, as she dug her hands into the earth, she heard the screen door creak. Tiny footsteps, a shadow beside her. He didn't speak. She didn't either. Just handed him a small trowel. They planted in silence, but it was the kind of silence that healed. The kind that says, "You don't have to say it. I know." After a while, Elijah asked softly, "Why do you come here?" Rosemary looked up. The sky above them was wide and kind. "I come," she said gently, "because someone once needed me, and now someone else might." He nodded, not quite understanding, but holding her answer in his chest, like something precious. That summer, the Rosemary house was full. Laughter echoed through the halls again, shoes lined up by the door, homework scattered on the table, boys arguing over chores, the echoes of a life Rosemary had lived once, long ago, now rising again like a familiar song. And still, she came, to cook, to listen, to sit. Sometimes she just rocked on the porch swing, watching the sun dip behind the treetops. One evening, Divine arrived with his daughter, now 5, running ahead of him with chubby legs and tangled hair. "Grandma Rose!" she cried, jumping into her lap. Rosemary kissed her forehead, laughing softly. "How's my little Storm?" "Fast," she said proudly. "Faster than Papa." "She is," Divine smiled, catching his breath. "Scares me half to death." He sat beside Rosemary, quiet for a moment. "You tired?" "Every day," she chuckled. "But I wouldn't change it." He nodded, then asked, "Do you ever wonder what your life might have been if things had gone differently?" She thought for a long time. "Maybe I'd have rested more, traveled, married someone else, lived in a quieter house." She smiled at the thought. "But then," she whispered, looking down at the little girl in her arms, "I wouldn't have had you, or your brothers, or this." She looked toward the house. "And I'd rather be tired from love than rested from regret." Time, as it always does, kept moving. The boys, now men, grew busier. More awards, more cities, more press. But they always came home. Birthdays, holidays, random Wednesdays. They brought their children, their joy, their grief, their lives. And Rosemary remained the same. Rooted, present, home. Years later, a reporter doing a feature on foster care reform interviewed dozens of people across the country. When she asked several successful professionals what moment changed their lives, many mentioned the same name, Rosemary Thompson. When the article was published, its final paragraph read, "In a world full of fleeting attention and broken promises, Rosemary Thompson was a constant. She didn't just raise boys, she built men. Quietly, relentlessly, without applause. And because of her, the world is softer, safer, and more beautiful." One winter morning, Kenneth sat beside her hospital bed. She was fading, not in pain, just drifting. The room smelled of lavender and old books. Her Bible lay on the table beside her. Photos of her boys surrounded the walls. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing her in gold. "You did good, Mama," he whispered, holding her hand. "You can rest." Her voice, faint and full of peace. "I'm not afraid." He smiled, tears falling freely. "Of course you're not." She closed her eyes and said, "Make sure they know. I was proud. We know." She let go quietly, as she always did, without needing the last word. The funeral was simple, just as she wanted. No flashy eulogies. Each son spoke. Divine read a poem he wrote just for her. Henry brought one of her aprons and laid it on her casket, whispering, "She wore this to war." The twins carried her photo through the garden. Kenneth read from the book, the one she never let him publish until she was gone. And Elijah, the boy who had once planted marigolds with her in silence, stood, now a grown man, and said the final words. She didn't rescue us. She reminded us we were never lost. Years later, A statue stood outside the Rosemary house. It wasn't grand, just a simple bronze figure of a woman seated on a bench, arms open, smile soft. In her lap, an open book. On her feet, worn shoes. On the base, only 5 words. She stayed, and we grew. And beneath the statue, in fresh soil that was turned every spring by a new generation of boys who'd found a place to land, the garden still grew, just as she had, with nothing but love and the quiet courage to keep going.